Right now we have the rather extraordinary privilege of speaking with, I would say, the iconic George Lewis, a composer, band leader, conceptualist, improviser, and one of the gentlemen who was involved in this morning's concert at 10 a.m. That was a performance by the trio, and you are about to see that replayed. But George has been more than just involved in the trio. He's been a real fixture of this year's Ojai Music Festival. Out in the lawn near the gazebo, there is an interactive sound installation. That's the word I'm looking for. Rio Negro 2, which is sort of ancient to the future, if you want to think about it that way. Handcrafted bamboo rain sticks that have been automated, and they perform individually or they perform together in rather remarkable serendipity. So there's been that. There was the solo flute with electronics piece Emergent in one of the gazebo concerts. There was George's opera Afterword, which I'm not going to say anything about now because I have George here himself, and we're going to talk all about this. Thank you for coming over to speak with us, George.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks very much.
I want to stop for a moment and say that, while I was running on about George being ubiquitous here, I should also talk about his role in the larger world. George is a trombonist, an improviser, a band leader, a composer, a pioneer in interactive electronic music. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow and a MacArthur Fellow. He's currently a professor at Columbia University and has also visited Harvard. So really, I would say, without any undue flattery, one of the actual living geniuses of American music. And
you're a sweetheart. Thank you.
Well, it's a thrill to be able to sit here and actually interact with you about all of these things that are going on. But the place that I want to start is with the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, or AACM, the organization formed in 1965 that has been kind of really sort of intrinsic or just below the surface of a lot of things that have been happening at this particular festival. Now, you joined, you said memorably, as a waif of 19 in 1971. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about what the association was, what it represented, and what drew you in.
I was drawn in because I was a waif and I needed someone to take care of me. And they could see that. But their larger purpose was to bring together, they wrote them in their purposes, in their, they incorporated early on in 1965, and they wrote a set of purposes on the Articles of Incorporation, which were actually real. I mean, they actually tended to do these things. Among them, bringing talented musicians together, elevating the culture of musicianship and musicians, facing the outside world, trying to really, and thinking about experimentalism, although that wasn't explicitly stated, but it was nonetheless the real reason for everyone coming together was that I think a lot of times maybe people who come from other kinds of communities, maybe majoritarian communities, don't realize that preaching to the choir is very important. You have to assemble the choir. You have to work with people to support them, support each other. Yeah, so the AACM was formed to serve one another, I think, in the end. And there was never any sort of, nobody ever told you in the AACM your work was bad. That's totally different from academic critique, Your work was always good. And the idea was that somehow, academic critique is like, well, they have to be told the truth about their work.
Right.
I think people really realized that you probably already knew the truth about your work.
Right.
You just needed to be in an atmosphere where you could actually work with that and have supported people to really support you and think about you and put your needs ahead of even their own. So that happened a lot in the AACM. It was a very selfless organization in many ways when I was in it, and then is now, I think.
And one of the things that I should stress that bears just a lot of repetition is that one of the four founders of the AACM, the pianist, composer, bandleader, conceptualist Muhal Richard Abrams, is among the three performers who worked together with George and with Roscoe Mitchell as the trio 10 a.m. this morning, and we're going to be hearing that concert right after George and I have finished talking. Muhal is just one of the giants of modern music, and I think in a very real sense, so much of what we're seeing at this particular Ojai festival was envisioned, imagined, and then enabled by what Muhal and his collaborators, Jody Christian, Phil Coran, and Steve McCall, founded around a kitchen table in 1965 and then put into play on the south side of Chicago. The third member of the trio, that's the with a capital The, is the saxophonist, woodwind player, composer, arranger, improviser, and writer of orchestral concerti, of which I heard one not very long ago, Roscoe Mitchell. And the three of them played a masterly concert this morning at 10 a.m. that you will be seeing shortly. Roscoe is most widely known for, I kind of stepped in it a minute with Muhal yesterday because I said that Roscoe was a founder of the Art Ensemble of Chicago, and Muhal said, no, Roscoe is the founder of the Art Ensemble of Chicago. So
That's true.
Right, exactly, because it was the Roscoe Mitchell Art Ensemble, then it was the Art Ensemble, and then when it was in Paris representing, then it became the Art Ensemble of Chicago. So absolutely, certainly during the 1970s and 80s, this was one of a handful of really, really flagship bands operating in the jazz world. And as well, the band is currently back together in a new form and celebrating its 50th anniversary with a number of performances around the world. You've also wrote the definitive history of the AACM. This is a book titled A Power Stronger Than Itself, erudite and scholarly and yet compulsively readable, a page-turner actually if you're involved in music in any way at all. How did you come to take that project on?
Oh, the original idea was to write a book about Muhal, actually.
Okay.
He said no. He said it would be okay. We should write about everybody.
Okay.
And that's where around about 1998 we were wandering around Cal Arts and with Wadada, Leo Smith, and Muhal and me. Because Wadada and Joseph Jarman, there have been various attempts to write books.
Right.
But, I was in a better position to write a book than many people were because I had an academic job. I had gotten a lot of support, including the MacArthur Fellowship and others. So that put me in a good position to think about. I didn't realize I was taking on about 10 years of my life.
Right.
But
This was a legendarily extended process, as I recall. We were anticipating it for a long time.
Well, that was a part of the marketing strategy for us.
Something on the order of 100 interviews, if I'm remembering correctly.
100 interviews. The book is almost 700 pages. Don't drop it on your foot. It's really, really heavy. But I think it does. It has It wasn't just interviews. A lot of these books are about people are just made. They're sort of oral narratives. And there's a bit of connective tissue.
Right.
I was trying to. A lot of what people commented upon. You started to see that it was in the urban studies literature. For example, I talked to Malachi Favors, who's the Art Ensemble bassist, about he remembered rats and fires when he was growing up.
Right.
In the early 40s. And it turns out rats, I knew about the rats because I grew up in Chicago too. And every alley was seeded with this awful stuff against rats. But I didn't know about the fires. It turned out the fires were set by landlords trying to burn out the migrants from the Great Migration because they couldn't get them out any other way. They were already crammed in these tiny apartments, like whole families in a single room. And then they didn't know how to get them out, so they would basically arson. And they would burn their own building and try to get people out, and they killed people. So that's what they remember. So these kinds of reminiscences actually had a basis once you did the secondary research or archival research or whatever kinds of research you had to do.
Well, and that's what I think is one of the really signal points about the book is that it is not a dry history or musical analysis of a particular group of musicians, but actually a very, very resonant, I think that's the right word actually, a very resonant slice of American creative life, and it points up the fact that the AACM was not just about original music, although that was a major, major portion of it, but that it was also about economic empowerment and self-determination and the fact that you were taking your affairs and your fortunes into your own hands and saying, I'm going to decide what constitutes my career, what constitutes my artistic oeuvre.
Well, I look at it as being part of the reason for writing the book was also to think about new subjectivities. I just finished an article for 20th century music, which I'm trying to think about the condition of 21st century music. And my rubric for it comes out of the wonderful the wonderful book by Raphael Confiant and others called Éloge de la Créolité, or Homage to Creoleness, Créolité. And the idea is that you're in a situation now where people not only have to take things in their own hands, but they have to do so in the face of oppression, in the face of resistance. And so the AACM still has a role to play in being an exemplar for how people come together to analyze their situations, to work under conditions of indeterminacy, but also to manifest agency. So I was interested in the social forces that produce this. And maybe musical analysis of the traditional kind doesn't bring that out. And plus, the other problem was there were like 100 people. Who was I going to favor in maybe putting on a CD of it? Here's an example. You don't want to make people an example. You can't do that in a collective. Everyone has to be given equal weight. So in the end, I was trying to it's an autobiography, but it's an autobiography of a collective.
And at the same time, most unlikely from a certain perspective, it is also the source of George Lewis's opera Afterword, of which we heard the West Coast premiere just a couple of days ago. Can you explain for the people watching us how it was that the Afterword of your book came to evolve into the opera that we saw?
Well, there were two people who were kind of important to this. The first was James Chandler, who is the director of the Franke Institute for the Humanities at the University of Chicago. I taught a class there with Arnold Davidson, and one day Jim said, "I think your book would make a great drama." And I said, "Are you kidding? It's just this academic book. You write academic books. I mean, drama, I don't think so." But he was convinced. He believed in it. So that softened me up. Then Sean Griffin got in touch, our director. He'd been working with Catherine Sullivan for 15 years, and I just loved their work. And they were trying to figure out what kind of opera they could do. Sean had sent me some materials in the mail, little things I could work with. I didn't know what to do with it. I'm not like Sean. I don't have a hand for materials. So I sent him the chapter from the Afterword chapter in the book, and I said, do you think this could be useful in any way? And he said, well, yeah, this is like exactly what we need. And so we built from that basis, the three of us.
And let's pause for a minute and talk about actually how the Afterword of the book deviates from the style and sensibilities of what came before it. Talk a little bit about the Afterword itself.
About the deviate from the style and sensibility of what?
Well, you've explained it as how you sort of went sort of lyrical and imaginative in your Afterword as opposed to the more rigorous history that preceded.
Oh, I see. Yes, it was a bit of experimental. My attempt to delve into experimental writing based on James Clifford's ideas about ethnographic authority and the idea of how ethnographers always have this authority which they do without really thinking about it. And so that kind of staging of quotes becomes a part of what happens in most books based on most ethnographies of that kind. So I took that and said, well, I can do this. I've done ethnographic work on the oral interviews. So what I did was I went through all the interviews, taxonomized them according to certain kinds of themes like aspirations about the future, ideas about race, musical aesthetics, relationship between art and life, these kinds of things. And so it staged a series of combinations, taking out quotes. And in fact, if you read the Ojai foreword, I kind of did the Ojai program. I did it again.
Right.
I used it as a means of writing the narrative for the trio.
Right.
But what you do there is there's a lot of lyricism already in what they're saying.
Absolutely.
I didn't have to try to be a creative writer. I'm not a creative writer. I'm an academic writer. But I can concatenate, I can recombine. I think I'm thinking about it along the lines of someone like Stan Douglas's ideas about recombinant narrative. So that becomes a sort of important touchstone for my own methodology. And then when I was in San Diego, I hung out with some of the language poets. So I just sort of looked over their shoulder while they were doing stuff.
Well, it was a very rich creation, I have to say, and I have to admit that beforehand I hadn't really imagined. I mean, I had this sort of half-baked idea of oh, I'm going to see Lester Bowie on stage depicted. What you actually did was you had these, the word you used was avatars.
Yeah.
And you put the language into the mouth. So different people sort of, as they flowed through time, took different roles.
Well, it's an opera. It's a Bildungsoper. And yesterday I was talking with Alexander Rothy, who has this great blog, and he wrote sort of a narrative about Afterword, the opera, for the Ojai website.
Mm-hmm.
And, excuse me, I'm having a hard time here. But we came up with the idea of a Bildungsroman, but a Bildungsoper. In other words, a coming-of-age novel. Because these coming-of-age opera, these were all young people exploring and trying new things out. They had no idea where they were going. I thought I'd made up the term Bildungsoper. I thought, well, that's a pretty cool term. You could do that with German. It's not that hard, it's easy. Then it turns out another student, former student, Harold Casidu, is in historical musicology, told me it goes back to Mozart, and that Humboldt was very involved in the idea of the Bildungsoper and Bildung in general, and so that became something I didn't mind not taking credit for that, but you see, it's also an opera of ideas.
Right.
Alex and I made up the term Ideen opera, so that's probably in there too somewhere, but it's an opera of ideas, and in that sense, I drew a lot from Brian Ferneyhough's Shadow Time.
Okay.
Which is also an opera of ideas, and the main idea progenitors are Benjamin and Adorno, and there's no sort of plot in the linear sense, not in mind. And he took a lot of heat for that in the press, and I've taken some heat for it too. This opera, there's no plot, and then the other part of the heat was that people expected it to be more about fighting racism and putting up this Manichaean black-white matrix, and everyone was struggling and all that, and that was just too simple. People were mainly fighting to find out who they were.
Right.
So that was the most important part that needed to be brought out in the libretto, which is the libretto is composed basically of what people said in the AACM meetings that I had tapes of, and also what they said in their interviews with me, and the odd quote from some odd place like Slim Gaillard or.
As one does.
or for that matter, St. Clair Drake. There's a secret passage from him in there somewhere.
Well, I found it an extraordinarily moving thing to have this history sort of enacted on stage, knowing that three of you, and actually more than three of you, Douglas Ewart is standing right over to the side right now, that you're all here in the flesh. You are mingling among us, you are interacting, and you are putting on new music, and that this saga continues. So it had this sort of really apotheosis sort of feel. I was very, very gripped and moved by it. And then again, I just seeing you this morning up there with Muhal and Roscoe, and that what you do together, that's completely open. Right? It's all spontaneous.
Open improvisation from the start. We've been together for like 12 years.
Right.
So we do things. We do them open. We do lots of other things. Muhal's writing orchestral music. I'm writing chamber music, orchestral music, operas. Roscoe's writing, and then we have a project where we just do totally open improvisation. Now, the thing that you said about this apotheosis was very interesting because the singers from the Afterword opera, they watched the pre-concert talk with Muhal and Roscoe, and they realized they were sitting there, and it was sort of an epiphany for them because after the opera, someone said, well, wow, something that Muhal said was actually in the opera. And that made me think about, which it made them suddenly think about who they were really playing, what they were really portraying. There were people, but there were also larger ideas that continued to resonate. And so I think that really played into why they performed so brilliantly. The singers and also Ice, everyone, and Steve Schick, everyone just dug into it because maybe that was the thing to do. Maybe we should have Muhal and Roscoe or Douglas, whoever, sort of, telling people what the piece is really about. But the other thing is this. Let me just say this. Mm-hmm. If it was just about exploring the history of the AACM, that's fine for me under the rubric of new subjectivities, which are not new topics in opera, but new subjects. In other words, new people that are included in the history of opera and are looked at as being viable topics, viable treatments, viable histories, and so on. That's important because we start to see that already coming in the 60s, where suddenly what African people say is important. So that is a little bit slower to come along in opera. So you see something like Anthony Davis's X,
Right.
The Life and Time of Malcolm X, where you start to see the most amazing thing about that, really, is the diplomatic summit between Beverly Sills and Betty Shabazz, where they each have to meet together, then go back to their constituencies, explain what the project is about. So the project is about new subjectivities. Or we see what happened with Anthony being a pioneer in that. And out of that, a little bit later along, comes something like Nixon in China, where suddenly the red Chinese are just, it's just sort of straw bugaboos up there, but
Right.
they're forces to be reckoned with. We have to think about these. So these kinds of new subjectivities are, I think, critical to looking at what's happening as we transition from 20th to 21st century music. So that's really what we're trying to do in the opera. Now, and also, finally, I think one of Vijay's themes here is empathy. And I started to find that empathy, I wanted people to get the idea that, we've all had our Bildungs moment. We're all writing our own Bildungsroman or opera. It's not just these people. I mean, that's why they're avatars. They're not characters that can be a set of property lists like a computer program or a video game. It's somehow that I'm wanting people to look at these figures and, wow, I'm having that same problem.
Extraordinary. Well, it was a very, very deeply moving experience, and also terrific to see the three of you on up on stage for the talk. And right now, we're going to see the three of you in action performing from this morning at the Ojai Festival.